I went to our company's year-end party yesterday and saw something strange on my way home. I got off at the closest station and was walking home when suddenly everything got foggy. I could barely see 20 meters ahead. I only live about 10 minutes from the station, so I was a little worried, but whatever. Then, I saw something in the distance coming towards me. It looked like a person, but it wasn't just one person. There were several. When they got closer, I saw it was a bride wearing a kimono. It was white, and she had traditional wedding headgear on as well. On either side of the woman were two men wearing black hakama, and behind them were two women dressed like Shinto priestesses, holding the hem of her kimono while walking. Behind them was a group of about 10 people, their faces downturned. Their clothes and even ages were different. There was an old guy in a suit, a high school girl, and even an old lady in Japanese-style clothing. What's going on? Why now? I wondered. But at any rate, I stepped back and watched the group go past. Nobody said a word. They were completely silent. All I could hear was the sound of fabric softly rubbing. After they passed me, they stopped in front of someone's house and all turned towards the gate, deeply bowing their heads. Then, one by one, they made their way up to and into the house. I stood there for a while, just watching. And next thing I knew, it was getting light out. I went home, took a shower, and went to bed. Then today, as I was walking past the same spot again, I saw a wake was taking place at the house the group stopped in front of. I'm so scared that I can't sleep. Hey guys, I'm your host, Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to another episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. We've recently made some changes to our Patreon. If you would like to support this show and get early access to all episodes, you can now do so even from the lowest tier. Finding, translating, and then recording stories is quite a time-consuming process, but you can help support the show and help us towards our goal of even longer episodes for all by checking out patreon.com/TaraADevlin. Our patrons are why this show is able to continue. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone who supports this show each month. And also, a big thank you to everyone listening right now. It makes me happy to know there are so many other people out there who enjoy this type of horror as much as I do. For this week's show, we're looking at stories of encountering the mysterious and deadly. Our first story is about two young boys who find a strange box buried in the mountains. One of the boys takes it for himself, but nobody's ready for what happens next. Find out why in Kanhimo. My mother's family home is deep in the mountains of Nagano, past a town called Shinshushin. When I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, I went there during the summer holidays. There was nothing there but mountains, rice paddies, fields, and some old houses. Public transport consisted of a single village-owned bus that only ran twice a day, morning and evening. I didn't visit this place with nothing to do every year, but that year my best friend went away with his family on a trip, so I accompanied my parents as well. And so I went, but as usual, there was nothing to do. I asked my parents to take me to the shops, but even the closest supermarket was an hour drive away, so they refused. "We came here to relax," my father said. My only salvation was the boy from the house next door, who often came over to play. He was the same age as me, and we quickly became friends. Kay, after this I'll call him K-kun, and myself soon started playing together all the time. Being the countryside, the only games we could really play were adventures in the mountains and exploring the nearby areas. Our trip was supposed to be a week long, and it must have been the night of our third day there. It was past 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set. Although it was summer, there were mountains in the west, so the sun seemed to set quickly. Kay and I decided to explore a mountain we hadn't been to yet. At first, we climbed a footpath, but before we knew it, we found ourselves on a thin animal trail. "What's that?" Kay pointed at something. I looked and saw what looked like a stone monument. It was like those statues of Saya-no-kami that you see in villages, the protector of boundaries. It was about 50 centimeters high, well worn by the elements, and covered in moss. We wanted to see the statue better, so using our hands and some fallen branches, we removed the moss and mud covering it. It definitely looked like a Saya-no-kami statue, but there was something different about it. Normal Saya-no-kami statues usually feature a male and a female huddled close together, right? But this carving had 4 people entangled together, their faces in pain. Sensing something strange, we stood up. "Let's go." Our surroundings were getting dark, and I wanted to go home. "There's something here." I grabbed Kay's hand to leave, but he found something at the foot of the statue. It was an old wooden box, a cube about 4 centimeters long. It was half buried in the dirt, the rest poking out diagonally. "What is it?" I had a bad feeling about it, but Kay dug it out without a second thought. It was old, bits of it rotting and falling apart. There were signs that it had once been wrapped in cloth, and there were characters written on it in ink. Of course, we couldn't read them, but it was covered in difficult kanji that appeared to be a sutra of some kind. "Something's inside." Kay looked through a broken part of the box and pulled something out. What do you call it? Velvet? It was black, glossy, and braided like a rope into a bracelet or something. It was about 10 centimeters in diameter, and there were 5 stones fastened around it. The stones were perfectly round, and again had kanji that we couldn't read carved into them. They were so shiny and bright that it was difficult to believe it had been buried in the ground. It was strangely beautiful and clean. "I found it first, so it's mine," Kay said, and tried to put it around his wrist. "Stop!" I screamed, nearly in tears. Something didn't feel right about it, and I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't let me. The moment he put it on, a strange bird or monkey or something screamed throughout the mountains. We suddenly realized it was dark, and feeling unnerved, we panicked and ran. As we neared home, We waved and parted ways. I went inside, but I couldn't forget that creepy bracelet. Later that night, the phone rang. It was past 10 p.m. and I was barely awake. "Go to bed," my mother yelled at me. The old black phone rang loudly. "Who could it be at this time?" my grandfather muttered and picked it up. Apparently, it was Kay's father on the other end. I watched from nearby and saw my grandfather's cheeks, rosy red from his evening drink, suddenly turn pale. After he hung up, my grandfather stormed towards where I was sleeping. He grabbed me and yanked me up. "Oi, where did you go today? Did you go out the back? Did you climb the mountain?" His attitude scared me, but I told him everything. Hearing the commotion, my mother and grandmother came running in from the bathroom and kitchen. When they heard my story, their faces turned pale as well. "It couldn't be," my grandmother said. "Maybe," my grandfather replied. "Isn't it just a superstition?" my mother asked. I had no idea what was going on, so I just stood there in shock. My father didn't seem to understand what was happening either, but judging by the appearances of my mother and grandparents, he also couldn't ask. At any rate, it was decided that my grandparents and I would go to Kay's house next door. Before we left, my grandfather called somewhere. My father also wanted to come, just in case, but they told him to stay and watch the house with my mother. When we entered Kay's house, I smelt something I'd never smelt before. Something dusty or sour. Thinking back on it now, it was probably the smell of death. "Hey, Kay, just hold on!" I could hear Kay's father screaming in the back of the house. My grandfather barged inside without announcing himself. My grandmother and I followed. The smell got stronger as we entered the living room. Kay was lying down, and his parents and grandmother, his grandfather had already passed away at the time, were desperately doing something by his side. I didn't know if Kay was conscious or not. His eyes were open, but unfocused, and his mouth open, but white spit and foam were dribbling down his chin. Looking closer, I could see they were trying to take something off his right arm. There was no mistaking it. It was that bracelet. However, it looked completely different to before. The beautiful ropes had pulled apart, and looking closer, I could see each one had pierced his arm. His hand had turned black, and the blackness was moving. It was like the strips of rope that pierced his arm were moving about inside his hand. "It's the kanhimo!" my grandfather screamed. I didn't know what he was thinking, but he ran to the kitchen. I couldn't take my eyes off Kay's hand. It was like countless bugs were crawling beneath the surface of his skin. My grandfather returned with a knife. "What are you doing?" Kay's parents tried to stop him, but my grandfather screamed at Kay's grandmother. "We can't save his arm, but it hasn't reached his head yet." Kay's grandmother cried, but nodded in agreement. My grandfather hesitated a moment, then thrust the knife down through Kay's arm. Kay's parents screamed, but Kay himself showed no signs that he knew what was going on. I'll never forget the sight of it. Not a single drop of blood fell from his arm. Instead, countless hairs noisily sprang forth from the wound. The black things inside his hand stopped moving. A short while later, a monk from the nearby temple came to visit. Well, it was rather far away, really. The phone call my grandfather made was apparently to the temple. The monk moved Kay to his bedroom and spent the night chanting prayers for him. We returned home, but I was unable to sleep for the rest of the night. Early the next day, Kay returned home with his parents before I got to see him again. They were taking him to a large hospital near where they lived. According to my grandfather, there was no way to save his arm. "We're lucky it didn't reach his head," he said repeatedly. I asked him about this kanhimo, but he wouldn't tell me anything about it. However, my grandmother told me that the word was written using the Chinese characters for head, to cover, and mourning. The statue we saw in the mountains was called Aku, using the Chinese characters for shadow and pain. Maybe it was some type of spell from the old days. But even when I saw my grandparents after that, they wouldn't tell me anything. If anyone knows anything like this, please let me know. What would have happened if it reached his head? Several days later, the original poster posted again. Hello, it's the person who posted about the kanhimo earlier. Thank you to everyone who showed interest in my post. However, it seems that no one knows about the kanhimo, After writing all that down, I became interested in finding out more myself again, and so I went to my parents' house over the weekend and spent some time looking things up. Sadly, my grandfather passed away a while ago, so all I had to rely on was my grandmother's stories and the books around the house. For the first time in quite some time, I reacquainted myself with the dictionary and did my best. To sum up, it would appear that this kanhimo is indeed a spell, and not a very nice one. In the past, the village used to be a small community that didn't involve themselves much with others. I don't know a lot about history, and I was unable to figure out exactly when it all took place. At the time, all marriages took place within the community, so of course, over time, the bloodlines became thinner. When that happens, children are often born with many problems. This was a time before science and medical growth. These children were called magago, unlucky children, and avoided. The women who gave birth to these children were called magatsume, unlucky women. However, it was the old days, so even if an unlucky child was born, they were unable to tell immediately. It was only after a certain period of time had passed that they came to understand. The eccentricities of these children were thought to be kitsune possessions or other such ill omens. Then, both the children and their parents were thought to call great misfortunes down on the village, and so they were killed. They weren't just killed though. The mothers were forced to kill their children by their own hand, and then the mothers were killed in cruel, terrible ways. I don't know the exact details, but considering these details weren't passed down, they had to be truly awful. However, it was thought that even after the women died, they still brought misfortune down upon the village. And that is where the kanhimo appears for the first time. Like I wrote earlier, It uses the characters for hair, covering, and mourning. In other words, it was a spell using hair to cover calamities. They bundled the hair of the mothers, made stones from the children's bones, and then used them to make a unique spell. They would bury this in the next village, which at the time was quite far away, and they didn't mix with them much, as it would cover that village with disaster instead. Although it was shaped like a bracelet, originally the meaning of the curse was much bigger. Also, while the one I saw was a bracelet, there were also others like collars as well. However, curses always come back to haunt you. When the other village realized what had been done, they dug the kanhimo up and returned it. In order to protect themselves from it, they came up with one answer: Aku, the guardian deity. When the villagers realized the kanhimo was buried there, they placed the Aku statue above it to seal it. Aku was originally called Kaku, with the first character of his name meaning to hang over something. By changing his name, they thought to once again protect themselves from the misfortune hanging over the village. The path to the next village led through the back mountains. Over time, the impurities possessed by the kanhimo vanished, but, as we saw, some of its power remained, regardless. This is everything I uncovered during my research. If there's anyone out there who knows anything else, please let me know. Lastly, I finally asked my grandmother what happened to Kay. After what happened, he was taken to a large hospital. It might have been thanks to the monk, but there wasn't a single hair left in his arm. And the wound and inside of his arm were clean. They stopped it from claiming his life, but Kay spent the rest of his days bedridden. Apparently, the doctor said there were several tiny holes in his brain, the size of hairs. If you ever find a kanhimo, whatever you do, don't put it on. Our last story is about a young woman who lives near an apparently haunted street. Her boyfriend refuses to walk down it, but one day she's too tired to care and decides to force the issue. Find out why her regret is swift in Salyoja. Two years ago, I was on a date with M-kun, and as always, he walked me back home. He said he could see ghosts, but I didn't believe in them at the time, so I didn't think too much of it. However, what always reminded me of it was the way home. There was a certain road on the way back to my dorm that he hated, and he always took us the long way around it. He said there was something unbelievable haunting that area, and so we shouldn't go near it. On this particular day, we went somewhere far away for our date, so I was tired and I wanted to get home as soon as possible. If we took the detour, it would take forever to get back home. I told M-kun I wanted to return home via that road, but he stubbornly refused. We ended up getting into a heated argument over it. Which is to say, I got angry, and he did his best to stop me. Sorry, M. In the end, I insisted that I would go that way myself, but he couldn't let that happen, and so he joined me. As soon as we entered the road, M-kun became visibly frightened, and his face turned white. It was around 11 p.m, but the streetlights were on, so it wasn't completely dark. To me, it looked just like a normal road. I became concerned and asked him if everything was okay, but he just said, "For now." A little further down the road, it split off into a fork. My house was down the left side. M-kun started to calm down a little, and so did I. Without hesitation, I entered the left side of the fork. The moment I did, the atmosphere around me suddenly changed. I couldn't hear a single thing, and the mood darkened. According to M-kun, my instincts were focused on what was in front of me, and so my field of vision narrowed. My feet went numb, like standing on a cold spot for too long, and I couldn't move. Strangely, despite all the strength leaving my body, my legs kept me propped up, and I stood frozen on the spot. Suddenly, a gust blew towards me. It was like standing next to a high-speed train passing by. Then, I heard a voice echo nearby. "Salyoja! Salyoja!" It was right by my ear. After the gust passed, I continued to stand there in shock. M-kun's pale face was nothing compared to earlier, and he ran towards me and started wildly slapping my legs. He hit me so hard that my legs later turned red and swelled up, but at the time, I couldn't feel anything. There was no pain at all. Soon, the pain started to settle in, however, and as feeling returned to my legs, I fell to the ground. M-kun sat beside me, and although his face was still pale, he sighed and said, "It's okay now." According to him, the moment I entered the left side of the road, a black haze descended like an avalanche and blew right through us, like it was enveloping us whole. Numerous hands reached for my legs through the haze, and that was what he brushed away. After that, M-kun carried me home as I cried, and stayed with me until morning. Now that's love. I grew scared of that road after that, and avoided going near it. But about 6 months later, that fear started to dissipate. Thinking I'd be fine during the middle of the day, I went to have another look. It was a road I'd walked down several times before, so being extremely careful, I went to have a look. What I saw astonished me. On this 50-meter road, there were 7 small shrines and Jizo statues all lined up. Not only that, nearly all of the houses facing the road had piles of salt by their front doors. There were even houses with offerings of sake and talismans pasted on their doors. On top of that, a large number of houses were abandoned or fallen into ruin. Oh yeah, when I mentioned earlier that taking a detour took us the long way around, even that's kind of strange. Looking at the divisions of the town, all the roads travelled away from just this one section, or stopped in dead ends nearby. The fork was the only road that led in, alongside some smaller, complicated paths that looked like capillaries. It creeped me out, so I asked one of my seniors at school, who was a local, about it. Apparently, it was a burakumin area in the past. But not only that, something terrible happened there during the war. And before the war was over, the entire village was destroyed. As for what happened, not even my senior would talk about it. it was something so taboo. Whatever happened, the locals were so upset that they refused to settle there again. More than 20 years passed before people from the outside came to live in the area once more. What on earth happened in that village? What does Salyo mean? I want to know more, but both M-kun and my senior at school warned me not to go digging any further, so I haven't. If anyone comes to visit an area of Hyogo famous for certain Yakuza headquarters, be careful. While the roads may suddenly cut off and take you the long way around, don't force yourself to take the quicker route. A few hours later, another poster replied with a possible answer to the original poster's question. Is it possible that the village was for Koreans? In Korean, Salyojo means help me. To Japanese ears, it's possible that would sound more like Salyoja. If you want to keep up with the latest Japanese horror news, as well as get even more exclusive stories, urban legends, and also freebies and discounts, you can join our newsletter at kowabana.net/newsletter. Newsletters are brief, to the point, and go out each Sunday, so don't miss out. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Tara A. Devlin. Thanks guys, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.